I am the president of a think tank and an advocacy organization in Washington. We talk a lot about women's issues and women's leadership. And, I think there's been a lot of discussion out there about whether the problem with a lack of leadership or the dwindling numbers we've had in some areas is whether women are leaning in or leaning out, whether they know how to negotiate or don't know how to negotiate. I think too often we actually blame women instead of thinking about other causes. In my view, the real challenge we face is that we have a culture that sometimes punishes women, doesn't really think of them as leaders, and we have too few public policies to encourage women to be leaders and to be equal to men in the workforce. So I now run an organization, but I was working my way through Washington for not wanting to age myself necessarily, but a good 20 years. I worked on campaigns, I worked in the White House, and I had these steps in various points. I remember working in the Hillary Clinton campaign. I was her policy director back in 2007. It was a leadership role. And, I remember calling a meeting where I had business leaders and academics, men and women. And it was my meeting. Well, I organized it. I was speaking about our public policies, the issues we're going to take up. And, I noticed that people in the room, a lot of the men, but even some of the women, older particularly, kept looking at my deputy who was sitting right next to me, looking at him to make sure, make eye contact with him, make sure what I was saying was right. They were checking it with him. I got so angry at the end of that meeting, and I was thinking, what is it? Is it because I'm short? Is it because I'm Indian? Woman of color? Is it because I was younger? I was 37 at the time. But then I realized, my deputy actually looked half my age. So it wasn't an age thing. I think it was really that I am not the traditional notion of leadership. It's like when we think of leaders, we do not think of someone who looks like me. We think of someone who looks older, whiter, maler. So, and why is that? I think one ways we can combat that is to have more women elected to office, more women CEOs. I run a think tank today in Washington, a progressive organization. And yet there are still, most of the rooms I'm in, most of the organizations I meet with are still tend to be older, whiter, maler. So we have a ways to go. Now, I think we can all say, look, it's good to get more women leaders. A lot of countries have half of what would be their Congress. Half of that is women. We're way behind. We're 20%. Obviously, it'd be great, in my mind, to have a woman president, more women CEOs. But how do we get there? I think often we just think that's just something that'll happen. But the reality is that if we just go by trends as they're moving now, the same pace, we will have a country where leaders are truly equal between men and women in 70 years. Let's think about that. Why is that? Why are we moving so slowly? And I think part of it is because we have a public policy dynamic in the United States which makes it so much harder for women to succeed if they're also parents. Think about it. In most countries, women have paid leave, families have paid leave, men and women have access to childcare. So that means that when a woman leaves the workforce, she comes back in very quickly. In the United States, new mothers are pushed out of the workforce 1 out of 3. 1 out of 3 women who graduate leave the workforce. Now, why did they leave the workforce? They leave the workforce because they don't have supports. We don't have systems of childcare like most other developed countries, and there is no paid leave, right? So if the childcare is so expensive, it makes more sense to be at home. But what happens to those women? It becomes harder and harder when they go back years later to actually make the same as men. In fact, women have a basically 20% reduction. And it's also just harder to stay on that leadership track if you never stay there. So I think we actually have to look at public policies like paid leave. Paid leave is a policy which allows women and men, I think women and men have to take it, but women on leadership tracks won't take it if men don't take it, because it becomes a stigma. We have to look at public policies like paid leave, which basically encourage women to stay attached to the workforce. And when they do that, they advance as much as men. Now, paid leave seems like such a reasonable policy, but fact is that only the United States and Papua New Guinea, only these two countries, the only countries in the world that have no system of paid leave for new mothers. Nothing. Now, I think that's pretty pathetic. Honestly, seriously. It used to be three countries. One of them was Liberia. But Liberia stepped up. And now it's pretty much us and Papua New Guinea. So, and I think we have to be reminded that this really affects families. In fact, 100 million private sector workers have no access to paid leave. So when a new mom, a new dad has a child, they struggle with the costs that are super high. And oftentimes women leave the workforce and come back years later and get off that leadership track. Now, what do we do in the United States? So people are obviously having kids, right? Still happens. A little bit later and later, but they still happen. What is actually happening is that each person is kind of pulling it together on their own. And they super rely on the benefit of a good boss, right? You're really up to the whims of your boss. Now, I know that experience because when I had kids, I was grappling with whether I would leave the workplace, take care of my kids. Now, I was really lucky, and part of the reason why I'm president of CAP today is because of the things I was able to do when my kids were young, that a lot of women can't do. So I worked at the time for a kind of person we've all heard of, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and I worked for her for several years before I had kids. And then when she was running for president, she asked me to be her policy director. And I kind of freaked out about the job, just to be honest, because I don't know if you've heard of presidential campaigns, but they're kind of 24/7. I really ached over it. And at the time, my daughter was 4.5 and my son was 1.5. So I was really like, I don't know how I'm going to pull this together. I mean, candidly. And, I talked with Hillary, I talked with the campaign manager, I talked with my husband, who definitely would have to pull more than his equal weight, would have to take on more responsibility as a parent. But, I thought I really wanted to do it. It was a big job. And Hillary promised to be flexible. Now, what ended up happening that year is that Hillary was flexible. It was great in many ways. I woke up really early, got on a morning conference call, got to work, came home for dinner. I mean, I didn't make the dinner, but I was there for dinner. I got my kids ready to go to bed. I read to them, put them to bed, and then worked, sometimes late into the night, really late into the night, but got the job done. Now, there were definitely stresses in that, right? I mean, flexible policies are really critical. I know that firsthand because I faced those stresses. I remember when my daughter was going to her pre-K graduation. And it was, I was sort of, working all the time. So I only got the note that her pre-K graduation was like a week beforehand and was the day I was scheduled to run Hillary's debate prep. And I went to the campaign manager and was like, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this because, it's my daughter's graduation, and they wear the cute motor boards and they have little outfits, and it was so cute. And knowing my daughter, she would tell me for the rest of her life if I didn't make the graduation. So I really, I honestly, I felt badly because, it was our first I was like running Hillary's debate in her mock sessions, and it was like, it was the second debate, so I was nervous. I was nervous about letting her down. And actually, truthfully, she changed her schedule so that I could make that debate. She totally moved. She went to Iowa later in the day instead of earlier in the day. And I was able, it was painful many times, but I was able actually to do that job. And it's because I had that job and I didn't have to leave the workforce at that time. I could lean into a job like that I was able to then work after the campaign. I worked for President Obama in the general election, then I worked on healthcare. But it was really that I had a boss who was understanding. But the problem in the United States, problem we have is that you shouldn't have to win the boss lottery, right? You shouldn't have to have an understanding boss who you've worked for a long time. We should have public policy that makes it fair for every worker. The truth is that 90% of low-income workers, between 90 and 95% of low-income workers don't have access to paid leave. And yet they need the support more than women like me. But that's what's wrong with our system. And that's why I think it's really critical that we think through how all these issues relate. How if we have a workplace which supports men and women, then more men and women will move up the career track. And when we have more men and women moving up the career track, we will have more leaders of both genders. And then when we see more and more of those leaders, when you see a short Indian woman, you will not think that that's a staffer, but you'll think that could be a leader. Thank you all very much.